I'll go ahead and get us started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we have a very exciting guest, our own John Wakefield. Just to remind you that if you have questions, to ask your questions through the Q&A chat, and I'm going to hand it off to Zach Almquist, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Peter. Hello. Many of you know me. I'm Zach Almquist, Department of Sociology. And one of my roles here at CSD is as the PRA co-chair in demographic methods. And so we're really excited to have John Wakefield in sort of that vein. He's a professor of statistics and biostatistics at the University of Washington. John is, among other things, an expert in spatial statistics and is actively advising the WHO and UN on COVID-19 related issues. It's my great pleasure to introduce and kick off the colloquium today. John, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Thanks for inviting me to do this. So yeah, I'm going to talk about, really summarize work I've been doing for quite a few years now. So this is going to be the rough outline. I'm going to motivate why I got interested in this problem, and then the small area models that we've been looking at, and then get into an overview of those models, then get into some detail and to particular models we use, talk a little bit, probably briefly, about this urban-rural thing, because it's just summarize where we're at with that, then go on a bit about reporting and visualization of results, and then I'll get into some conclusions. And I should say, because I'm sure by the end I'll be going at warp speed, so the last slide has got, you know, the people who helped on this, but the primary person who's been working on this is Jessica Godwin, who is here and very closely connected to CSDE. So she deserves a huge thank you for all the work she's done on this project for many years now. So the problem we're looking at is that for many people living in low and middle income countries, there's no coverage by civil registration or vital statistics systems. And so you have to base estimation or trying to ascertain births and deaths, how many people were born, how many people die, has to be based on household surveys and censuses. And so what I'm going to focus on is the under 5 mortality risk, or U5MR. That's seen as a key indicator of the health of a nation. And so I'm going to specifically look at trying to estimate under 5 mortality at admin 2 level. And so I'll talk about what that means, or the motivation for that. But admin 2 is basically 2 below the national level. So in the US, states are admin 1 and then counties are admin 2. And so this changes by different countries. And so but that's the level. Admin 2 is the level at which typically policies are implemented, health policies are implemented. So here, just to give a context to all this work, the under 5 mortality risk is typically reported in terms of deaths per 1,000 live births. So it's the number of kids who die before they reach their age 5. So from the latest round that was reported here, I've just gathered not a random sample, but here's a bunch of countries just to show you the range across the world that this risk takes, or this rate takes. So we've got at one end of the spectrum, we've got countries like Norway and Japan that have very, very low risk. So we know that this is attainable. We know that, I mean, unfortunately, some children will inevitably die before their 5th birthday, but we know that can be a very, very small number. And so then with the other end, we have some countries such as Nigeria and Somalia, which have very, very high rates. And so the aim of this work, of course, this work is descriptive epi to try and catalogue those discrepancies before we can start. This is at the national level, before we can start doing something. Well, so then we know the size of the problem, and then we know where to put our efforts. And we see there's a whole bunch of countries, you know, so then we have some of the Western countries, you know, like the UK and the US. They have, you know, they're relative to the rest of the world, they're low, but, you know, not as low as they could be. The countries like Cuba, which are at 5. So it's interesting, the range over which these, you know, they're not interesting. I mean, it's devastating for some of these countries, but there is huge variation between countries. And as we'll see, there's huge variation within countries as well. And so what we're trying to get at is this. So the SDGs were these Sustainable Development Goals, which set targets such as an under 5 mortality rate of at least 25 per 1,000 live births for every country in the world. And then within that, they wanted these results disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, and then geographical location. So that's one way I'm going to highlight in this talk, but we've looked at some of these other categories as well. And so that's the aim, is to try and understand the subnational variation in under 5 mortality. And so the available data that I'm going to focus on is household survey data, but there are different types of data that we can lean on. And so these household surveys, there's many different types. We've focused on DHS so far, with some work on Jessica's done some work with mixed data, and then there are other surveys as well. We're trying to expand all the time the type of surveys that we include. And these gives what are known as full birth history. And so typically women between the age of 15 and 49 are interviewed and then asked for the birth dates and, if applicable, the death dates of all the children they've had. And so there's an interesting retrospective nature to these data, that you don't learn just about a picture of child mortality now, you learn about it historically as well, because a woman who's 49 could have given birth at age 16, and then we learn about that what subsequently happened to that child. So we can learn something from over 30 years previously from the subset of women who we're now sampling. Another form of data, which I'll talk less about today, but is ongoing research. We're doing ongoing research trying to include these data, is what's known as summary birth history. This is where you obtain the mother's age, and you don't obtain the births and death dates. You just determine how many children a woman had, and then how many of those children died, but with no deaths. So there's clearly information, with no dates rather. There's clearly information there, but you don't actually get to know when the births and deaths were. And those data are typically far more extensive than full birth history data. Just we haven't found an efficient method yet for including that data in a way that we think is reliable. There's also vital registration data available in some parts of Latin America. And again, we've done very limited work so far, but we're always looking to increase that work to so we can look at more countries. So just to give you an idea of what these surveys are like, because a lot of the work we've done is trying to account for the survey design, because, you know, in all statistical analyses, your analysis has to be consistent with the data collection system. And so typically, for as an example, in Kenya, there was the last 3 DHSs were 2003, 2008, and 2014. They're when the schedule is a typical schedule is to collect these data every 5 years amongst certain countries in the world. The DHS do this, quite a lot of countries actually, and they use stratified 2-stage cluster sampling. So what they do is they stratify the country both via its geographical areas, typically admin 1, and then also by urban and rural. So 2 of these surveys in 2003, 2008 stratified by urban and rural cross with provinces, and then the third one was a much larger DHS, and that's stratified by county as well. And then all the women between, so you stratify by county, you decide on how many, county and urban rural, for example, in the last survey, you then decide on the numbers. Some power calculations are done to see how many numbers of households, clusters you should sample within each of those strata. So for example, there were 92 strata here. So that's 47 times 2 minus 2, because 2 of the counties are wholly urban. So you have 92 strata. You decide on the National Statistics Office decides on how many clusters to sample, or enumeration areas, so villages or parts of cities are sampled. And then within those selected clusters, you then select households. Typically 25 to 30 households are selected. And then all the women in those households are interviewed. And then so we get, as I said, we get all the birth dates for all the children, and then for any children who died, we get the death date also. And then what the DHS, so the deal here is, because you've got stratification and clustering, the usual methods we use for analyzing these Bernoulli events, so 0, 1, birth or death, death or no death after birth, we can't use regular, just say a logistic regression or something like that, because that doesn't acknowledge the data was stratified and that they're clustered also. So the stratification, if you ignore that typically induces bias. So for example, they typically oversample urban areas. And so because urban risk tends to be lower than rural risk of the child dying, if you ignore the urban oversampling, you'll underestimate child mortality, because you'll be focusing on this non-representative oversampled urban population. And the cluster sampling messes up the standard errors, because the data are no longer independent, which is what all the usual software implementations of logistic regression will assume. You've got independent outcomes when you don't, because people within the same cluster are liable to be positively correlated, and so that typically reduces the amount of information, and so you need to inflate your variance estimates to reflect that. And so what the DHS supplies are these design weights. So actually, beyond design weights, they have they don't have any post stratification for those who are interested in survey stuff, but they do have a non-response adjustment. But what we're going to think about is the design weights, and then they also give you the GPS coordinates of the clusters. They're slightly jittered, but I won't get into that aspect, meaning for confidentiality, they don't give you the exact locations. They throw in some random error, but I'm not going to get into that today. I've worked on that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And so here's just a picture of, so the difference between these two pictures, there's the 8 provinces indicated here by the solid black lines, and then these are the 47 counties. And these different colored dots show you where the sampling was carried out over these 3 surveys. And then because of the retrospective nature, so for example, in the 2013 survey, which was then reported upon in 2014, we see that, so the darker colors here emphasize where there were more births, where we saw more births. So back in this 2014, we do get some very little bit of information. So the eldest women here will give some information back from this 5-year period, but then the information grows as we go through. And so the last 10 years, we've got a lot of births, therefore a lot of power to estimate under 5 mortality over the country, but that decreases as we go back further in time. And so the task here is that, so I've got a little history timeline of my own work in this area, but the UN Interagency Group for Child Mortality Estimation, or IGMI, they've been producing national estimates of under 5 mortality for many years now, using a model which was developed by a former student at UW, Leontine Alkema, and one of her colleagues. But now, so they wanted to, so rather than national estimates, they'd like to get a subnational. So whereas this is for all countries, we've only reported recently, as we'll show shortly, for 22 countries. And so we're going to use just this household survey data. And all the way through this work, we've really tried to emphasize transparency and reproducibility. So that's one of the reasons why we've only used DHS data so far, because we think our methods are the most well developed for that. And so we can give the clearest description, and we've got the best idea of when things may be going off road, and we're not convinced by them, by using these not simple, I wouldn't say they were simple methods, but they're developed specifically for these type of data. And so we've been slowly piecemeal adding in countries and different data methods, because we're trying to do this very conservatively, because it's the UN, and well, in general, you don't want to get these numbers wrong. And so here's just how I got involved in this. So back 5 years ago now, I started going to the UN IGMI these bi-yearly meetings that they have, or bi-yearly, 2 a year. So then I've had this working group, STAB, for quite a few years now. Jessica was in there at the start, and it's had students, and mostly students, PhD students from all over. I mean, a lot of departments within UW, plus there's a group in Trondheim, Norway, who Andrea Riebler and Geir-Arne Fuglestad, they came on sabbatical here, and so they got involved in this work. And so over this period, this was really a period, Jessica was involved in some of these meetings, convincing the UN that we were bona fide, that our methods were reliable, and that we would, we would come up with the reliable estimates. And so we did this, and then initially we published 35 countries, sub national estimates for 35 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, just at the admin 1 level. So using using the survey weights only, we came up with a method to do this space-time analysis. And so we did this. We had a paper on this read by Richard Lee, and then they finally the UN said, okay, we trust you now, produce some subnational estimates, and that's what we did early this year. So back in March, we produced countries for estimates for 22 countries, and you can find these pretty easily if you go to the UN IGMI website. And so they did some nice graphics. And yeah, here's I've just summarized the countries we looked at. So these tables just show you the countries, and then the number of admin 1 and the number of admin 2, then the number of surveys we based the estimates on, and the years of those surveys. So for example, Malawi, we had for the last 4 surveys, there are 28 admin 2 areas, and we produced estimates for that. And then some countries such as Kenya, they have there's always a little bit of ambiguity about what admin 1 and admin 2 means, and that's changed over time. And then some countries such as Pakistan didn't want us, so there's a country consultation process that goes ahead. So the estimates went out to the National Statistics Office in Pakistan, and they looked at the estimates and said, we think the admin 2 estimates are too wide, and so they're not useful. So we don't want you to publish those. We just want you to do the admin 1. So that's why some of these countries we only put in admin 1. But these are what so here's the, here's the quote unquote the answer. So this is what we found. Here's the point estimates of under 5 mortality, or expressed as deaths per 1,000 live births. So this is at the admin 1 level for 2019. So you see most of the countries were in Africa, then with just 3 countries in Southeast Asia. And then these are the admin 2, the admin 2 estimates also. And so you see this finer detail. And, you can see there's lots of variability. So here, these levels around 150 to 200 in some subnational areas, so a fifth of kids are not making it to the 5th birthday. So that's the problem we're trying to identify. Okay, so this is a problem in small area estimation. And so small area estimation is a very interesting field, which has been, really accelerating in its development over the last, last 10 years, certainly. And so there are 2 approaches to analyzing data from surveys. One, the sort of historically most popular is called design-based inference. So in design-based inference, so regular statistical modeling, you always start by saying, I assume my data Y, my observation, I see a realization of a random variable Y, where Y is assigned some distribution, or we write down the mean and variance of that random variable. And then we might do prediction to those unobserved people. So under design-based inference, it's a very, very different way of thinking. It's very intriguing. It basically says, okay, I'm going to set up some design from a finite population. I have a finite population of N people in a country, and I'm going to go out and sample some of those people. And what's random is the actual, so there's a bunch of outcomes here, Y1 through YN. So let's just say that's death. These are all the kids in an area who were born in the last 5 years. And these are indicators, 0, 1, whether the child subsequently died or not. Those numbers are not viewed as random. They're just viewed as a fixed set of outcomes. If we did a complete census, we went out and measured everybody, we'd know the answer. There's no randomness. So what's random is the labels of the kids that were actually selected. And so there's a sample of kids who are selected, and all design-based, or sometimes called randomization-based inference, all the criteria based on, imagine I took different samples, what would the properties of my estimators be? And so it's a very different approach. And so the most basic estimator here is called various names, but one name of it is the Horvitz-Thompson estimator. It's just a weighted estimate. You take a weighted mean of your observed, the people you actually did, the kids you did sample, where the weights reflect the sampling design, and you come up with some variance where the variance is just, again, accounts for the design. So there's a lot of beautiful theory around that's been developed, and this is a very, very nice thing to do if you've got sufficient data that those weighted estimators are reliable, meaning do they have variance which is not too large. So this is just an overview, this slide, of small area approaches. So there's 2 a key dichotomy in small area estimation is whether you base models on whether you have an area level model or a unit level model. Area level models instantly target the areas you're interested in. Say, I'm going to get a weighted estimator at the level of your of the level. So admin 2 level, we're going to get a weighted estimator of under 5 mortality, and then we're going to smooth it. And so that's what you directly get an estimator, and then you smooth that. Under the unit level models, you actually model the outcomes. You used a model-based approach. And then so in this approach, you don't use the weights. You build up a model for the stratification and the clustering. So I'm going to give some more details on that, but that's the overview of these small area models. They're either area level or they're unit level. And this is the way I think about this, that if we had a ton of data at, say, admin 2, then just go with the weighted estimators. They're very reliable. They've got very few model assumptions, and as long as the variance isn't too big, you get a very reliable estimate and everyone's happy. So if you don't have a reliable variance estimate, though, because the data are too sparse, or maybe there could be very little data in one of your target areas, then you can do an area level spatial model. So you can do some spatial and maybe temporal smoothing as well. So you use the fact that in nearby areas are more likely to have estimates that are similar. So the under-5 mortality rate tends to be relatively smooth across countries. So you can leverage your neighbors' results to get more reliable estimates in your area. And the same in time as well. That you, unless there's some there's a conflict or there's a natural disaster, you're likely to see smoothness over time as well. And again, you can leverage that. So you wouldn't expect your estimate in a particular area to move so much from, or the true under-5 mortality in an area won't be so different from what it was in the previous year or 2 years before that. So if you can just, if your weighted estimators have got a good, are available. So I say available because so the poster child of the difficulties we see is Nigeria, because Nigeria has 778 admin 2 areas, which is an order of magnitude greater than nearly every country, other country in sub-Saharan Africa. And a third of those areas contain no data. So you clearly have to do some smoothing there. And so then that's when we're led to these unit level models, when we have to do more model-based approach. And that's fine, except that you now have to be very careful because you have to make more assumptions. And so if you're not careful, you're more likely to make mistakes because the assumptions won't be valid for the data you've got. And then you're going to just get biased estimates with inappropriate variance estimates. Okay. So yeah, I won't go through this, but we've done a lot of work. So Lena Mercer, another student here from a close connected person to CSDE, she in her thesis she looked at just doing space time, these area level models for Tanzania, and that's what grew into the work we did with Richard Lee on the 35 countries. And then we've just gone through various iterations here. So some of Jessica's work has looked at how we can use summary birth history, and we're not quite ready to incorporate that in our full-on methods yet, but we're getting closer. More recently, we worked with the DHS they have these spatial reports, and we gave recommendations for modeling for under-5 mortality and a computational pipeline with a bunch of ARCOs, so people can now run these models relatively simply. And then just very recently, Gerana and Richard and I wrote a paper summarizing all the methods. So here's our weighted estimator. So we just take so the notation's a bit over the top, but we have a binary outcome which says, did so we sample NIT children in year T, we have NIT children in area I, and then this is the number of those children who died. And so we weight these via the sampling weight, which is a function of how likely it is that area was going to be sampled or not. And then under the small area smoothing model, so now we can say, okay, let's take the log. This is a 0-1, this is a probability. So let's take the log to get the whole of the real line. We can say, well, that's normally distributed about the true log of that under-5 mortality rate with some variance. So that's a direct area-based approach. A model-based approach, again, I'm just a simplified model here. We'll get more complicated later. So here I'm just considering a binary outcome, dead or alive. Later on, we're going to consider a hazards model, which says, okay, a child, as you might expect, the probability of dying changes very rapidly over the first 5 years of life. So we wanted to acknowledge that. So we're going to talk about a discrete hazards model later. So, but at the most basic level, we could say, okay, the number of children dying is binomial with some out of the total number of children sampled. So this PICT is just the probability of dying in cluster C, area I in year T. And we can write down this logistic regression model. It just says, okay, the odds change multiplicatively as a function of whether your area is urban or whether that cluster lies in an urban area, because we expect to see possibly quite large differences in under-5 mortality between urban and rural areas. Then we have some space-time smoothing term over here. And then we have just some IID shocks. So just random things that might happen, which may or may not be true signal. It might be just some aberration of the survey sampling in that area was done poorly and that cluster was done poorly. So we don't want to, we just allow for some wobble around this overall surface. So it's not over smoothed. Now this is a bit, it's a bit heavy on notation here, but it's actually quite intuitive. But one of the huge problems is when you're trying to do small area estimation is that if you have a model at the cluster level, so in our area, you know, we might have 1,000 true clusters, but we only sample, you know, 5 of them. So we have to go from these 5 to try and make inference about the whole area. So I think probably the easiest way to think about this is empirically. We say, okay, there is a true number of deaths in my area and a true number of births. And that's made up. We can decompose that into, in my complete area. So I've got some area I, there is NIU urban clusters and NIR rural clusters. That's what's actually going on. There is a finite set of clusters. We know this is true. If we went in and sampled everybody, there would be, so maybe, let's say, you know, we have 200 urban clusters and 800 rural clusters. And the prevalence, the overall prevalence, meaning, so prevalence here is an empirical proportion of kids that die, is the prevalence in each of those areas. So we have 200 prevalences in each of the 200 urban clusters. And then we have to weight that by how many, so we have this weighting term here, which is the urban proportion. And then we have the rural prevalence weighted by the rural proportion. So what I'm trying to get at in this slide is that there is an empirical proportion of kids that die. And then there's something that's, most of the literature and modeling it's done in this area previously is called this as defined. Well, they haven't defined it actually. They've just been kind of very wishy-washy on what this actually means. What they're measuring is what I've called the risk. The risk is the theoretical infinite population prevalence. So imagine our area, if we replicated it, the people in there an infinite number of times. This is most of the time what we're doing in statistics. When we say there's a probability, that probability is a theoretical, that's a probability in a hypothetical infinite population. And in that case, what we're doing is we now integrate over, so we replace this sum over a finite number of areas. So this is what's always done previously, is to say, okay, in an area, we've got this risk surface that's wobbling around, and we just integrate that with respect to population density, and that's what gets us the risk. So the key idea on here is that we have to go from a finite set of clusters, we have to aggregate to the area level. And that aggregation step is fraught with difficulties because we don't typically know where people live. There is a sampling frame, you know, back at the census, they created a sampling frame, but we never get access to that. We don't know where everybody lives. So we have to use some extra information to do that aggregation process. And the more and more work we do in this area, more and more we get frightened by this step, because every time you do aggregation with an unknown surface, or here, this proportion, you're introducing potential errors. And it's very hard to get a handle on those errors because the available information is not there. Okay, so yeah, that's just basically what I just said. So another overview of what our modeling says is, okay, we have a mortality model. So we're going to fix now on this cluster level model, because if we're going to get to admin 2, we can't do area-based estimation directly because we simply don't have the samples. We don't have sufficient samples in an area to do that, in all areas to do that. We just, when we try and do that, if we say did it at admin 1 at a 5-year level, that's fine. And that's what we did in the paper with Richard. But when we get down to a yearly admin 2, we just don't have the information. The data's too sparse. So we have to actually now model the individual outcomes and then extrapolate upwards to the greater units. And so we have this mortality cluster model. So that's the hazards model I'm going to talk about. Then we have an urban rural classification model. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but basically we build up a model, we build up a surface of where we think people live in, the proportion of people who live in urban and rural across the country we're interested in. And then this aggregation model combines these two by those steps I showed earlier. So here's the picture of how spatial smoothing can be carried out. We can model at the area level. So we just assume a discrete set of areas and that the smoothness between those areas, or we could assume there's some underlying continuous surface. And the models I'm going to talk about are going to be these ones, because again, this one is more fraught with difficulties. You know, this potentially gives you more information because you can model at the so-called pixel level. But the problem is you have to then get more refined information when you do the aggregation, because you need additional continuous surface information to get the estimates. So I couldn't go into that more if people want me to. So here's just the intuition behind our model. So So basic, survival analysis. So following previous work, we're going to assume a discrete hazards model. And so just very simply, surviving to 60 months of life means you survived your first month, then given you survived the first month, you survived the second, etc. So 60 things need to happen for you to get to age 5. You need to survive the first, survive the second, given the first, blah, blah, blah. And so the under 5 mortality, so in demography speak, so this lovely notation where you get, so to survive, this is 60Q0 IST, this is saying, okay, in year T, survey S, area I, the probability of lasting, of surviving, typo there, one minus this, the probability of surviving 60 months is given this quantity, so the probability of dying is just 1 minus that. And so this is the usual multiplicative, hazards thing we do. Is every time you do a Kaplan-Meier curve, you do this. You're basically saying to get to age 60, you have to survive so these are the probabilities of dying in each of the constituent months. So again, just to write it out in full, the probability of dying this is the probability of surviving. So this is the probability of dying in the first month. So the probability of surviving is 1 minus. This is the probability of dying in the second month, given you survived the first month. So 1 minus that is the survival probability. And so you can code this up as a logistic regression model. So that's what I've shown. Then you just have to extract the relevant coefficients from that logistic regression model. So there's your discrete hazard. Just as pictorially, what we have is we don't have 60 distinct hazards because that would be too difficult to estimate. There's not enough data. So what we say is the probability of dying in the first month. We know that, roughly speaking, half the kids that die by age 5 die in the first month of life. It's the most critical, most dangerous period in the first 5 years of your life. And so we allow one parameter to estimate the hazard of the first month. Then we say the hazard is constant months 2 through 12, 13 through 24, etc. So we estimate 6 different hazards. And what we actually do is we estimate those hazards as a function of space and time and survey. And so here's the model. Here's the beta binomial model I'm going to talk about. So, okay, so so my son is wholly unimpressed by everything I do, and in particular my work. So to try and get him interested, I said, I've got a model that's called BB8 because it's a beta binomial distribution. So there we go. And then there's 8 reasons. This is the most contrived acronym known to man. And so anyway, but we did try and highlight the things that we do in this model. So yeah, there you go. So it's the BB8 model. So so we try and model consistent with the data collection mechanism. So we try and acknowledge the design via stratification and clustering. So for example, in contrast to IHME, we do country-specific models. We don't model at a broader scale. Each country has its own space-time model and its own distinct model in terms of the way we model natural disasters is very different in different countries. We do space-time smoothing. We benchmark to the UN national estimates because those national estimates are based on way more data. So we want to be consistent with those. We make an HIV adjustment. We do Bayesian inference. We've spent a lot of time, Richard Lee in particular, mostly Richard, developing this summer package, which is now growing into a generic small area estimation Bayesian package. So we have both area level and unit level models in there. So there's actually a lot of functionality in that now. And then we've spent a lot of time thinking about visualization. I'll get onto that shortly. So this is the most horrendous slide in the talk. So that's all in my talks. That's a claim to fame. So, but it's actually, each term is intuitive. So what we've got is we've got a number of kids that die in age group A, cluster C, survey K in year T, out of a number that were in risk. Then we have a monthly hazard ratio. Because it's a beta binomial, that is an over-dispersed binomial because we need to acknowledge the clustering. So we have a scale parameter to determine how much dependency there is between outcomes within the same cluster. Then we have, we have to model this hazard ratio, this hazard rate, the monthly hazard, probability of dying in the month M, given you survived to the start of that month. And then we write that as a function of a bias term due to HIV. So we're missing mothers because particularly in the 90s, in much of sub-Saharan Africa, there were HIV epidemics. And so that killed many mothers. And those mothers that died, they'd given birth to children who were themselves more likely to die. So because we never get to see those mothers in our survey because they died, then we need to make an adjustment to increase, basically it's informative missingness, because those children who are missing are more likely to have, who never got the chance to appear in the survey, are more likely to have, the children of those mothers that died are more likely to have died themselves. So we make an adjustment based on previous work the UN had done. We benchmark to the UN national figures. Then we have urban-rural terms, which are a function of month. We have a survey effect, so every survey could be systematically higher or lower, so we're around for those. We have these IID terms. We have temporal terms over, so these urban-rural, we have urban-rural intercepts, so at age 0 and then at time 0, and then they change over time and they change over age. Then we have spatial terms and space-time interactions. So this is all, these terms here are doing the space-time smoothing. This just shows you pictorially what this complicated model is, hazards model is doing. So there's 2 sets of lines here. So the different colors, these colors here were both for 0 to 1. So this is on a log scale. So this is like 36 deaths per 1,000 lives birth. So we see here that this solid line, the solid red line is the rural, I believe this is for Malawi. This is the rural hazard ratio as a function of year. And then this is the urban hazard ratio. So this is an interesting case. We've seen this in a couple of countries that it seems like urban, so this is neonatal 0 to 1, that seems to be increasing. So overall under 5 mortality is decreasing, and it's decreased quite a lot. And we can see that in all of these curves. These 5 pairs of curves are for the other age bands. So for example, this yellow one here is death in months 1 through to 12. So this is, so there's the top line is the rural risk, the dashed line below in that mustard color, whatever it is the urban risk or the urban hazard. And so these pairs of lines are always, you know, the solid line is always above the dashed line in all but this neonatal case. So there's something strange going on in neonatal, which is why we need to model these things individually. So we have, so this is changing over time. So we can see these curves are all dropping, which is good news. That means under 5 mortality overall is dropping, but neonatal is not dropping. It's pretty much flatlining. And that's why now neonatal is like 50% of child deaths is neonatal, whereas 20 years ago, that was quite a lot smaller, because the other bands have gone down, but neonatal is not in general, or has dropped at far less the same rate. Okay, so this just shows you the formulas that we use to get the urban and rural, risk in each area. We just do the old hazard thing I showed earlier, and then we just average those 2 things to get the overall risk. Is just the under 5 mortality is the under 5 mortality in urban times the proportion of urban times plus the rural under 5 risk times the proportion of kids that are rural. Okay, that's benchmarking. We won't get into. So Taylor, Taylor's a biostat PhD student. She's been working on this for a while now, and we've got a method now for doing the benchmarking quite a coherent and computationally efficient way. This next bit I'm going to go over fast because I don't really have a lot of time. So the key idea is we build up, we take a bunch of covariates such as log nighttime lights and log population density. So this is for Malawi. And so we take these covariates and we build up a classification model. So we've got this supervised learning problem where we're trying to label we've got all these data that we collect, which are labeled as urban and rural. And we want to do that for the whole country, because then we can do the aggregation. We want to know, we can model urban and rural risk in every area, but to go up to the complete area level, we need to be able to average. So we need to know how many kids are urban and how many kids are rural. So we build up a classification surface. So this is the probabilistic classification on this side, and then this is the binary classification 0, 1. So this shows these, Malawi is predominantly rural, but when you get these, so I think this is Blantyre, this is Lilongwe, they're the 2 major cities. So I can't see this because of my pen colors, but so this is how we do a classification. And we just looked into various algorithms, including, we've looked at gradient boosting trees, we've looked at logistic regression, we looked at Bayesian adaptive regression. We try and account for the jittering, because the jittering, that's, remember, where they randomly move the locations of the clusters. That's problematic because urban clusters can drop outside. So we do a little bit of pre-work. This just shows you the overall accuracy of our method is pretty good. You know, it's this is when we don't correct for the jittering. This is when we gain a little bit. So we're getting up to about 95, 96% accuracy, which is pretty good. We'd like to do better. This just shows how these urban rural fractions in each of these 28 areas in Malawi change over across the different methods we've come up with. You know, they're relatively constant, but not completely. You know, we do see some differences. This is just a map of the urban fractions in Malawi, the 28 districts of Malawi. So again, we get Blantyre, which is the capital is Lilongwe, but the commercial centre is Blantyre. This is using gradient boosting trees. This shows how the estimates in each area change as a function of whether you do an unstratified analysis, i.e. ignore urban rural, or whether you acknowledge it. And so, you know, we see some differences shown up here. In general, the stratified estimates are higher than the unstratified, not by a lot, but they are higher in general. So we would if we ignore stratification, we do underestimate child mortality, which is obviously the worst way to do it. Okay, finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit about reporting, about how we tried, you know, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about nice ways of presenting the results, because, you know, the model is kind of complicated. So we really need to convince people it's coming out with reasonable estimates. So these are what we call spaghetti plots. So these are, again, the 28 areas in Malawi. So we see, you know, it started out with horrendous levels, you know, 20 to 30% of kids dying before the 5th birthday in 1990. So now we're much lower than that. We're down to, like, you know, whatever that is, but, you know, between 40 and 50, 60 maybe. So, but there's still relatively large differences within the country. This just shows you that and mapped versions of that. So these are just point estimates. So this just shows you the posterior medians over the last 20 years, well, including predictions going forward. So with the last few years here are predictions. These are what are called ridge plots. So here we lose the geographical information, but this nicely, so these are showing the posterior distributions over the last 20 years, or yeah, last 20 years. And so we can see that, you know, back here, there was much more, you know, the level here is up to, this is 15 per 100. I don't want to change the scale on this one, but, you know, you can see there's quite a lot of variation in here. Here, they're much closer together, but still, this is a prediction. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty, you know, these things, you know, like, are quite uncertain. And that's just a function of the limited amount of data we have. These plots, I like these sort of go backwards because they make it a lot simpler, go backwards in a certain sense. So Tracy Dong and I developed these, what we call true classification probability. So over here, imagine if I was to, suppose I say, okay, I want to look here. I'm going to say, let's say the level 7 deaths per 100. So I could say I suppose I'm only allowed 2 colors. So which way around is it? Yellow and blue. Yellow is to the left and blue is to the right. So this area would be classified as yellow because more than 50% of its mass is to the left of the value 7, et cetera, et cetera. I could classify every area as blue or yellow depending on how much of the mass lies either side of this threshold value. But notice that, you know, if I make this threshold here, there's still if I do this, maybe there's 80% of the probability to the left here, but there's still 20% to the right. So under this model, it's saying there's a 20% chance that coloring it yellow is wrong, right? Because there's a 20% chance it's bigger than 7. So that's what we do. And so what this plot shows is that if we pick 2 colors, my threshold is now 43 deaths per 1,000 now. Every area here, there's a bigger chance that we're in, you know, so all the blue ones, there's more posterior probability above 43 than below, etc. But there's still a chance of getting it wrong. So this average true classification probability basically averages what the correct probabilities are. What's the average probability to the left of, or to left or right of 43? So here we can say that if I randomly put my pen down on this map, there's a 67% chance that it's colored correctly. If I go to 3 colors, so now I allow myself 3 colors, then there's only roughly a 50% chance that the area is colored correctly. So this was trying to get over in one map, because everybody gets bored. You show them one map and they're like, oh yeah, wonderful. But then they don't want to see a second one. You always say, no, you've got to see the uncertainty map as well. Don't believe that first one. but they're just, no, we got the story, it's fine. So we want to have a map which somehow implicitly shows the uncertainty. And so this map shows that, because the flatter the posteriors are, the quicker these average true classification probabilities plummet. So that's what we were trying to get over with on these maps. Okay, so conclusion. So these are the countries the 22 countries we did in 2019. We've been continuing the methodology. There's a ton of people involved, as you'll see shortly, but we've made a lot of headway on the stratification, getting a better urban rural classification. Jörn Wu's been working on that, and we've got a long way on that. Taylor's got the benchmarking pretty much sorted now. We've started looking at mother's age, because it's clear that probability of a child dying is a function of mother's age. And because of the weird sampling here, this retrospective nature, we're not comparing like with like. When we look back to 1990 from a survey in 2015, those estimates are based on women who were 40, 49 now. So that they were very young then. And so their probabilities of having a child that died is much greater then. So we're probably underestimating child deaths. And it changes as we go through time. So we're trying to account for that. So we're trying to bring in other types of data as well. Trying to bring in, so continue this work with summary birth history data, because that's a very important source of information, particularly historically. And then we're trying to, by bringing in these extra data sources, hopefully we're going to expand the country list. In general, we're doing conflict adjustments. We're always looking at more efficient computation. I didn't mention this, but we're using the INLA software. And so the modeling is very, very fast. It's seconds. To fit one country, it's seconds rather than days. If you used MCMC here, it would take days, those of you into Bayesian computation. But we're always looking to get better, quicker, because the end point here is for people, national statistics offices in the countries themselves, to do these estimates. And I've been out to a few workshops, like Malawi, South Africa, Ecuador, and presented software. And I've worked with statisticians and researchers from those countries, and actually, they were all. So the South African one was Southern and Eastern Africa. So it was a bunch of countries were there. And of course, there's limited computer power. So we've really got to improve the methods so they're usable. And then just overall, and we're also looking at a bunch of other, we're looking at a bunch of other indicators as well, because we want to expand beyond just underfunded. There's a whole bunch of health and demographic indicators which are interesting to look at subnationally. And the good news is that U5MR is decreasing in most low middle income countries, but it's still, many countries will not attain, if things continue as they are now, they will not hit those UN targets by 2030. So we want to be able to highlight those areas and see how so the countries and the health districts know where they should be looking out for what is causing this in my particular district, and what can we do to try and avert that. And as you might imagine, this is a lot of people. So as I mentioned, Jessica has basically led the effort on all the subnational, the 22 countries work. Richard has been heavily involved in the methods developing the computation. So that the Stab Lab, that's my favorite hour of the week, is the Stab Lab, where we'll meet and discuss. We have speakers and discuss papers and continue this work. So this is a wonderful group, which I love meeting with. Gerana and Andrea, and they are both based in Trondheim. In the DHS, we've got some great collaborators, Ben, Rose, and Trevor, amongst others. The UN, IGMI, and the technical advisory group, they've helped out massively all the way through. So we're very appreciative of them. And then if you want to look at more stuff, this is the website. I store everything. And so, if you want to look at more stuff, or, you're more interested, just, drop me an email if you have any questions. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. Do you have a moment to answer some questions? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So I forgot to mention that we have to cut early because John has to run off to teach a class right after this. So if anybody has any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A so we can have some answers.
I can't actually see them. Are there any messages? I can't actually see
No,
them.
I don't see any questions yet. So, I mean, if there aren't any questions, I guess we can cut early so you can get to class. John's obviously here at the UW, so I'm sure if you have any questions, you can always email him or something like that too.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, I don't need to run off. I mean, if people want to disappear, but I can hang around for the 2 or 3 minutes. If anybody does have any questions, I'm quite happy to sit here or not as well.
I have one question. This is all like developing countries. Have you tried this in the context of like Europe or the US or even like parts of Asia or something?
No, I mean, we've done parts of Asia, but yeah, no, we've never done it in high income countries. And so, yeah, it would be interesting to do that where we know roughly what the truth is. You know, if we could find a survey which had a similar household design and just to see how close we get. Yeah, because I mean, I didn't talk about model checking, but model checking is very difficult because we have such limited information. So we can do model checking at a higher geographical level. And, you know, if we collapse over space and time, we kind of know what the answer is. But doing model checking at yearly admin 2 level is virtually impossible. So to do reliably anyway. So no, it would be interesting to look at, if not under 5, other things such as fertility or under 5 as well. I mean, that would be interesting. But yeah, we have focused on Southeast Asia and Africa so far.
Very cool.
So we do have some questions, John. So one from Laura is, have you given any thought to trying to account for birth transference? The comments about age heaping got me thinking about other CBH errors.
No, thanks, Laura. I haven't done that yet. I actually today I downloaded a paper from the big demography conference that's going on in a couple of weeks. That there's a paper about age heaping that somebody's just brought out. But yeah, that does trouble me, the age heaping, and so it is on the infinite list of things to look at. But I haven't looked at it yet. No. So Kyle, can you talk about the big picture differences? You're trying to, yes, you're putting pull the pin out and hand me the hand grenade, Kyle. Thank you. Yes. So the big differences. Well, so the country specific modeling is one big one that we do because one clear difference. So one big difference we did see. I mean, often our estimates are similar to IHME's. The uncertainty is quite different, or can be different, but many cases we do correspond, and no surprise because we're both based on household data. I mean, we try and adjust for the design more. IHME basically ignores the survey design aspect. One of the reasons we haven't used summary birth history and we haven't used information. So, for example, some of the mixed surveys don't have full geographic information, and IHME has got a method for doing that, which is very ad hoc and basically makes no sense. And so I've written a couple of papers with Katie Wilson and one with Katie and one with Neil Marquez, another CSD guy, showing that method is incorrect. And that's just in general our procedures. We try and publish the papers in statistical journals first, the methodology papers, and then once they get reviewed and improved upon, hopefully by the critiques, then we apply them to the full-on analyses. So the way we do crisis adjustments can be quite different. So in Myanmar, there was a cyclone in 2011, and the way IHME apportioned out the extra deaths, there was quite a considerable number of casualties from that cyclone, and they apportioned them over the whole country. But we did some work, and it only affected the coastal regions, right? It was a tsunami, so we apportioned the deaths to the coastal region. So because so of course we do far left. Yes, thank you, Jessica. Oh yeah, I've got the date on 2008, Cyclone Nargis in 2008. So because we do country level models, and we don't do so many outcomes or countries, we can make country specific models and bring in the context. We don't use the same space-time moving. Not only do we allow the parameters of the spatial models we use to be different, we also we might have different temporal models as well in the countries. We have different temporal smoothing models because we don't want to have the right amount of smoothing. That's always a worry here, that you over smooth, you get rid of all the highs, right? You reduce the highs too much. So that's one thing we've spent a lot of time doing. The other thing I noticed is that all our estimates are completely reproducible in the sense that if you download the DHS, I mean, that you can't run our code. The DHS, we can't stick DHS data in a package, but if you download the DHSs and run our code, you will get the same answers as we've got in our papers. So it's completely reproducible, and it's very hard to reproduce the IHME results because it's so complicated. The under 5 work brings in so many other different data sources in so many different ways, and but our methods, uses smaller sets of data, but it's completely reproducible, and we think that's very important. So, thank you, Kyle. Thank you.
And Asia Sutton is asking for the urban rural classification for Malawi. I think you use night time lights. How common is that as a method of validation? She thinks it's very clever. So,
well, thanks, Asia. Yeah. So we that was just one of the covariates. We actually used quite a few covariates. Yeah, that was one of the ones that is obviously very important for urban rural. But we built, so we basically have a suite of covariates, and we used, I can't remember how many we used, but I think depends on the country, between 6 and 10. We take all these covariate surfaces, and then we either use logistic regression or we use a machine learning algorithm. And then we do classification on the basis of all those covariates. And then we build up, then because those are we use covariates that are available on a grid. The problem is always with all this stuff, I mean, in general, covariate modeling, we'd like to do more of it, but it's really tricky because of, because you need the covariate everywhere. Doing association studies with DHS data is relatively easy because you only need data where, the clusters you observe people. Whereas if you want to go to small area estimation, you have to do some aggregation. So that's why we need covariates, which are available everywhere. And the big problem is we don't know where people live. The National Statistics Office has information on that, but it's not publicly available and it's usually out of date. So we base a lot of what we do on, that's why we try and avoid these continuous spatial models, because it's too sensitive to the population density on a continuous scale. The discrete models require just the proportion of people who are urban and rural, not knowing what every pixel, whether it's urban or rural or not. But thank you for that comment, Asia. I should probably slither off and
thanks so much, John, for giving this wonderful talk. Of course, you're around, I'm sure. If
please do ask any other questions. Please do. Yeah.
So have a good class. We're off next week. Join us on December 3rd for our next talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Zach.